Okay, so this is chapter 14, War Between the States. We just finished up chapter 13 with the firing on Fort Sumter. And so now we officially have the North and South at war. Here are all of the headings and subheadings for this chapter. It's a big chapter. There's a lot of information. You're going to find that most of it is going to be about different battles, commanders, who won, who lost, strategy. So it might be a good idea for you to take your notes and divide them up into the 4 C's that we've talked about before. The causes, the contestants, the consequences, and the course. And so instead of doing Cornell notes for the entire chapter, if you want to take, section 2 and section 3 in particular, maybe even section 5 or parts of section 5, and put those into that kind of a chart, that would be fine. Okay, so your objectives for the entire chapter, your objective for the entire chapter, is that you should be able to analyze the causes of the American Civil War and draw conclusions about the nature of civil wars in general. And take some time here, pause, go through the chapter, and I want you to create a prediction statement on the top of your notes. I'm going to be looking at this. It's going to be a decent percentage of your notes grade, about 10 to 15, maybe even as high as 20 if I start to notice that no one has done it. I predict that blank will lead to blank because blank. Please try to keep your prediction statement to this format. Remember, you're not reading the whole chapter before you come up with a prediction statement. It doesn't matter if you're off, okay? It just matters that you went through the material enough that you kind of start to have an idea about what we're going to discuss. It helps you guys remember. The more times you look, I swear, the more times you look at your chapter, even if it's just skimming, the better off you're going to be on the test day. Okay, so this is a war of brothers. And what do we mean when we say that? We mean that it is a war between people that know each other, between people within the same country. A lot of these, especially the commanders of both the Confederacy and of the Union, went to school together, served in the military together, know each other pretty well. Families, especially along the border states, ended up going to different sides and ended up fighting against each other. Take a look at some of these questions. This is something we're going to discuss in class, or I'm going to have you write in class, so don't worry about copying any of this down. Or that, okay? So what were some of the causes for the Civil War? Even today, people cannot agree what caused the war. If someone says slavery, other people will say, no, that's not really the issue. It was more about states' rights. It was more about the nature of the Union. Even though really, honestly, if you look at it, you know that slavery was one of the causes. It made them take a look at, should we be allowed to leave the Union? So the whole question here is, could states that voluntarily join the Union voluntarily leave the Union? Most people at this point in time, or if you look at someone like Thomas Jefferson, so wait further back, at the founding of the country, a little less than 100 years from the Civil War, look at the Constitution as a contract. That when we ratified the Constitution, when each state ratified the Constitution, they agreed to join the Union. And some states, obviously the southern states here in this case, would say that if that contract was broken, then we have a right to leave the Union because that contract is void. Okay, so if you have any questions about that, please ask me in class, because I might be able to come up with a few more examples for you that will make that more clear. Okay, so the South's point of view on this question is exactly what I said, that if the Union broke that contract of the Constitution, according to them, the Union wasn't looking out for their best interests, they weren't enforcing the Fugitive Slave Law, or Slave Act, they weren't, they wanted a high tariff, and we'll go more into that in a little bit, and they just felt like the South wasn't being supported. Abraham Lincoln is elected president without any Southern votes, so they feel like their voice is not being heard, and that is not what they agreed to, so they feel like they can leave the Union. And then the North's perspective on this is that that's not exactly how the Constitution works, because then you'd have people leaving every other day, right? And it's kind of funny because back in the War of 1812, it was actually New England that was threatening to leave the Union because they were unhappy with what was happening at the time. and felt like a resolution needed to be made because it was affecting the economy of New England. And so across history, it hasn't just been the South during, antebellum times that wanted to leave the Union. Across our history as Americans, there's been pockets here and there that have said we should be able to leave. But that all kind of changes here with the Civil War. Okay, so here's slavery. Your textbook's going to say it's not a primary cause. And this is when we can talk about things like textbook bias. Textbooks are very political. Most textbook editors and writers, they want their textbooks to be liked by the most amount of people possible. And so they're going to handle issues in different ways that they think are going to get the most sales for their textbook, if that makes sense. If we look at a textbook like your textbook, you're going to see a bias come out here because it's published by a Southern publisher. If you read this chapter, I think it's a very beautifully written chapter, but it's also you can see how sympathetic it is towards the South. And I think you have to take into consideration that Bob Jones University is in the South, and that's who publishes your textbook. So take it with a grain of salt when it says that slavery was not the primary cause. Slavery was definitely one of the primary causes. That is what people have been arguing with. If you don't remember Chapter 13, the whole issue that causes, bloody Kansas and all of these different arguments in Congress is the issue of the expansion of slavery into the new territories. So I really don't think it's right to say that slavery was not the primary cause. It's definitely one of them. Remember that the North is not entirely abolitionist, but that's really where the abolitionist sentiment is centered. Realize as well that the North hasn't had to depend on slavery, so they don't really understand it. A lot of Northerners haven't experienced it, haven't been down South, don't really know a lot about it. But they don't get confused, though, because Northerners are still pretty racist. Many of them do not want the slaves freed because they feel like the slaves will be freed and then they'll come up north and try to take their jobs up north. People that are abolitionists, remember we've talked about this before too, are very pro having a freed slave colony in Africa. And that's why we'll have a place like Liberia. So don't think that the North is just this region where everybody thinks the slaves should be freed and believes in equality, because that's not the case yet. Okay? The South's point of view is that slavery is actually good. They're actually taking care of the slaves. It's better for them because they look at the slaves as an inferior race. Their whole way of living, their whole economy is tied to slavery because it's agricultural. And they're pretty, worried that if they don't have slaves, then their whole way of life is going to just crumble. Okay, so some other issues here. We have not just slavery, but we have patriotism and how that patriotism comes out in different ways. So for the South, many people aren't going to look at the Union as the place that they're going to feel the most loyalty to. They're going to look at their home state, their counties, their cities, their towns that they live in. For example, Robert E. Lee, who has this great heritage of patriotism. He's the son of Light Horse Harry Lee, who, he was a Revolutionary War figure, and his wife, Robert E. Lee's wife, is the step-granddaughter of George Washington, so he's this great kind of American history heritage. He actually hates slavery, and he doesn't believe in the secession. And Lincoln, actually, Abraham Lincoln will offer him field command of the Union Army because Robert E. Lee is a great commander, and we'll see that play out here in the Civil War. And the Union would have been very lucky to have him, but he refuses that offer because he feels like he's not going to be able to fight against his, brothers from Virginia, pretty much. He's not going to fight against his home state. So it says, I have not been able to raise my hand against my relatives, my children, my home. He's just not going to be able to join the Union, even though he doesn't necessarily believe in the point of view of the South. Okay. We're going to look at resources. We're going to begin to compare the North and South. The North had an advantage in population. There's way more people living in the North. They're producing actually more food, because you would think, probably you're thinking South, agricultural, they would probably be producing more food. Well, that's wrong. Really, the South focused on cash crops, focused on things like tobacco and cotton. They're not focused on producing actual things that you can eat. So there's a lot less of that in the South than there is in the North, actually. And then the North has the South beat in industrial output, because the South, or the North is where all the factories are. Remember, we've seen the cities are starting to grow up around factories. So when we have things like uniforms that need to be produced, the North is going to be able to put uniforms on their soldiers much more easily than the South. The North is going to be able to manufacture weapons much more easily, okay? So lots of things that are important to winning a war. They have twice the railroad mileage built up in the North, so they're going to be able to transport soldiers faster and supplies faster. So that's significant. Okay, number-wise, they have 5 times the number of factories that the South has, and they have 10 times the amount of workers that the South has. Okay, leaders, though, and leaders are very important. We're going to see that in the beginning of the Civil War. You're going to notice it's not going to quite work out the way that you would think based off of who has more, okay? Leaders, actually, the South has got superior military leadership compared to the North. And you'll see Abraham Lincoln's going to have to fire quite a few generals, replace them, move them around, until finally he gets to Grant. And Grant's really going to be the guy that kind of gets things going for the North. So for the South, though, we have people like Robert Ely, you have Stonewall Jackson, Jeb Stuart, Nathan Bedford Forrest, just very, very strong military leadership. Also think about the kind of lifestyle that these people have in the South. They're used to being outdoors. Most of them, know how to ride horses, and they go hunting on a regular basis, as compared to the North, where we're living in cities, very industrial. That's not the type of leisure activity that is happening in the North for the average soldier, okay, or person that will become a soldier. Okay, so strategy, the North is going to go on the offensive, meaning that they're going to actually go into the South, and really their goal is kind of, we want to, regain these states, okay? And I'll go into more detail about this in the way that they look at the southern states when we get to Reconstruction in the next chapter. Okay, General Winfield Scott proposes the Anaconda Plan, and here you have a picture of what this looks like. He pretty much says that we need to pretty much choke the South out, kind of. We want to keep them from shipping out or exporting their goods, and we want to keep them from importing goods from other places. So pretty much this plan sets up a naval blockade. So it goes around, you see the Atlantic over here in the Gulf of Mexico, and then you have going up the Mississippi. Well, it kind of goes up the Mississippi, but he's got it in this picture drawn out further west. But this is kind of the whole goal, is to choke out the South, and that's why it's called the Anaconda Plan, because the anacondas, they constrict, right? They'll wrap around their enemy, right, to choke them out. So anyway, all right. Confederates are on the defensive, so pretty much their goal here is to outlast the enemy. If they can keep fighting the enemy until the enemy is exhausted and gives up, then they will win. And you have to think about kind of motives here too, or motivation. When you have Southerners fighting on their own ground, defending their own homes, they're probably going to fight a lot harder than Northerners coming down. And think about like an average Northern guy who's like 18, who's drafted and might not really believe in freeing the slaves. This idea about the Union might seem kind of vague and far off to him. His motivation to fight is probably going to be a little less strong than the Southerner who's defending his home and really believes in this cause. Okay, so here's your paragraph shrink. Motives, causes, comparisons. Let's go over your SRQ. What was the main issue that sparked the Civil War? It's the nature of the Union. You can talk about states' rights, whether or not a state has the choice to leave the Union. Why did some Southerners consider the Civil War to be a second American Revolution? They saw themselves as patriots fighting against an oppressive centralized government. And you're going to see a lot of similarities as we go through this chapter between the American Revolution and the rebels versus the British that you'll see here with the South versus the North. Just like I was talking about the different motivations, it would have been the same during the American Revolution. You would have had the patriots here fighting on their own home ground, and then you would have had, you know, young guys from England coming over who, you know, this was just kind of their job and they're being sent out to do this, and it was kind of a vague, you know, there wasn't a lot of passion behind their cause for fighting the patriots. A little different here though, but you will see similarities. Which side of the war had the advantage in basic resources, population, food production, industrial capacity? That would be the North. And why was Winfield Scott plan to win the war called the Anaconda Plan? And it's the blockade, the naval blockade, and hopefully it would slowly crush the South because it wouldn't allow them to get supplies in or out. Okay, this is the bonus question if you're actually listening to the lecture and not just watching it. Your bonus question will probably ask you something about this slide.